Hi, folks. This is Jonathan, an organizer with Hmong Innovating Politics, and I just wanted to give you a rundown of the youth empowerment campaign that HIP, in solidarity with the East Bay Asian American Youth Center of Sacramento, did in the spring and summer of 2016. Just to give you some perspective of what the young people were able to accomplish here in Sacramento, I just wanted to give you an overview of some of the goals that our coalition set up as we began to mobilize and enfranchise young people throughout South Sacramento, actually North Sacramento and throughout the BHC area. So the first thing we really wanted to do was to make sure that the young people that were active participants in the canvassing and the phone banking would be able to develop some tangible skill sets. Oftentimes in campaigns, we know that young people are taken for granted. They're usually used as regular volunteers. Campaigns kind of eat them up, spit them out. But at the end of the day, in order for our communities to really, truly progress, it was important that young people also develop the organizing and civic participation skill sets to be able to mobilize their community, organize their community in a thoughtful and strategic manner. So that's the first thing we really wanted to emphasize, was making sure the young people develop tangible skill sets. The other thing we really wanted to do was target historically disenfranchised communities. I'll show you a map later on about some of the areas that we really focused in on, but it was a very focused and targeted and strategic approach to how we wanted to go about canvassing and targeting voters throughout the Sacramento region. And in particular, we wanted to reach out to communities that are oftentimes ignored by traditional campaigns and have historically been disenfranchised. And of those disenfranchised voters, we wanted to target Southeast Asian American as well as other low propensity voters, including Latinos, African Americans, folks that are not part of the traditional political infrastructure. So this is kind of a timeline of how things played out. A lot of the effort and groundwork was laid in November of 2015 when the initial idea for Measure Y, just as a backgrounder, Measure Y was a 5% tax on the cultivation of medical marijuana for the purposes of creating a youth-specific fund that would go to support youth services throughout the city of Sacramento. In February of 2016, the City Council voted to put Measure Y on the June 7th presidential primary ballot. And so that's when really the gears started churning. In March of 2016, EBAYC and HIP agreed to support Measure Y. It was a thoughtful, deliberate process because of all the various issues that become wrapped up in the concept of being able to tax the cultivation of marijuana. But at the end of the day, our emphasis was really to begin and develop plans to train and mobilize youth. Our campaign and canvassing efforts launched in April of 2016, and it carried on every single weekend all the way until Election Day. In May 2016, our young people joined the phone banking efforts of the Yes on Measure Y campaign, and all of it culminated in June of 2016. The young people participated in their first GOTV weekend. We did poll checks, canvassed on Election Day. Unfortunately, as a byproduct of the final tally of the votes, Measure Y did not receive enough votes. But that being said, we celebrated the actions and the dedication of the young people in June of 2016. So just to give you some perspective and a look at what the key targets were in our areas. First of all, I think it's important to mention that all of our efforts were nonpartisan. We really wanted to make sure that this was an issue-based campaign to really bring into focus the need for youth services in Sacramento. That is at the core of what Measure Y was, and that still continues to be the fight for both EBAYC and HIP and organizations throughout Sacramento. The other unique thing about this canvassing effort was that we targeted the areas where our young people lived in. And so if you look at the map, we targeted the areas surrounding their local high schools. So we focused in on Hiram Johnson, we focused on Grant Union, as well as Burbank High School. And so, in and around these areas, unfortunately, they live in communities that have historically been disenfranchised, areas where campaigns usually ignore because there aren't enough high propensity voters. And so, what we did was that we focused and expanded the universe of the folks that we would be knocking on the doors of and phone banking. So, we focused on moderate to high propensity voters, as well as including in the universe all Asian Americans that would come up in the voter roll. So those were our main targets. What that looked like was that since the launch in April, for every single weekend, the young people, young leaders in EBAYC were out canvassing alongside HIP organizers. And then on top of that, the youth from EBAYC attended the main campaign's phone banks and were some of the most regular attendees, consistently being present to make sure that they were contacting voters. So here's a breakdown of what the vote ended up looking like. In Sacramento County, there were about 267,000 votes cast in the June primary of 2016. This is actually positive news because it's a 7.7% increase from the primary from the previous presidential election cycle. But to give you some perspective about the impact that the efforts of the EBAYC youth and HIP had, 15 to 20% increases were seen in voter participation in the precincts that HIP and EBAYC canvassed. So voter turnout in these historically disenfranchised, historically low propensity precincts dramatically increased. In total, HIP and EBAYC were able to outreach to 6,500 voters. Of that 6,500, we were able to identify about 2,000 positive IDs around Measure Y. And then ultimately, we were able to calculate that about 1,400 of those individuals ended up voting yes on Measure Y. So how did Measure Y actually perform? Overall, in the city of Sacramento, Measure Y received overwhelming support. It received 65.34% of the total votes cast. This is tremendous. This is much more than a majority vote. But unfortunately, because of the existing laws in California, any parcel tax, any type of local tax would require a 2/3 majority. So you needed 66.7% of the vote in order to pass. So unfortunately, Measure Y was not successful in receiving passage. So just to give you some perspective, if you looked at all of the other precincts outside of the ones that EBAYC and HIP canvassed, Sacramento voters in those areas voted 64.5% in support of Measure Y. But if you looked at the precincts that EBAYC and HIP canvassed, these low propensity, historically disenfranchised communities, we saw 72.27% of those precincts voting yes for youth services. What it showed us was that when young people are empowered, and when you have youth-driven campaigns that specifically target the communities that they come from, we can win. These young people are the margin of victory, and when deployed effectively, when it's collaborative, when it's thoughtfully and strategically driven, young people can help lead campaigns to victory. And so overall, we were able to make tremendous strides in increasing civic participation throughout Sacramento, particularly in areas that have historically been disenfranchised. And beyond that, these young people are continuing to stay active despite the results of this campaign, and we look forward to all the accomplishments that they have in store for us moving forward.